Hello and welcome to this panel called Driving Efficiency in Cross-Border Payments. Thank you so much for joining this session. I'm your moderator and my name is Ellie Duncan. I'm head of editorial and content and broadcast at Open Banking Expo. So we represent a global community of open banking and open finance professionals who are joining in with this kind of digital transformation effort. So, as I say, delighted to be joining you today, and I'm really pleased to introduce a topic that is really relevant and to be joined by three expert speakers. So they're going to be exploring the challenges, the changes and the opportunities within the world of cross-border payments. And we've got a mix of perspectives from England or the UK, from Canada and the US. So we'll go into some questions momentarily, but let's start with some introductions. Elena, why don't you kick us off?
Yeah, great. Thank you. Thanks for having me. So my name's Elena Whisler. Myself and my team, we are the kind of industry engagement at the Clearinghouse. So the Clearinghouse is the US's private sector market infrastructure for payments. So we process wires, ACH, check images, and real-time payments. And we process about $2 trillion a day. And it's, an exciting time, I guess I'd say, talking to our customers and our evolving ecosystem that we have here in the US.
Great. Thank you very much, Elena. Great to have you with us. John, over to you.
Hi there. Yes, I'm the UK representative, along with you, Ellie, and work at the Bank of England. And I've been working for the last few years on our RTGS renewal programme. RTGS is the name we've given to our high-value payment system that supports all electronic settlements in the UK and hosts the CHAPS payment system specifically. And the kind of relevance to this topic, I think, is that you could think of RTGS as the sort of sterling node onto a global payment network. And so as we're thinking about how we renew RTGS and rebuild it, we need to think about how it fits into the kind of global context.
Great, thank you very much for that introduction. And last but not least, over to you, Alish.
So hello, my name's Alish Novak. I'm the Canadian representative here, working with Payments Canada. Specifically, my domain of expertise is real-time payments, which we are in Canada in midst of developing. Obviously, the discussion currently is, or rather, the implementation currently is domestic, but certainly the foreseeable future will need to acknowledge the fact that cross-border payments are part of the scope and the vision of the rail itself. So, hello.
Great, thank you so much, and lots to talk about, as you've all alluded to there. My first question really to all of you is kind of about the cross-border payment landscape, really. So giving us all a bit of context, a bit of background for the rest of this discussion, I suppose. John, I'm going to come to you first on this one. So what trends have you been experiencing in your jurisdiction? And do you think it's fair to say that this segment is receiving a bit more attention over the past few years?
Yeah, absolutely. I want to kind of relate my part of the answer to kind of work I was involved with at the G20. Back in 2020, when it was Saudi Arabian presidency of the G20, cross-border payments was picked out as a particularly kind of important topic for focus, and a kind of collaborative work between CPMI, FSB and other agencies were kicked off to try and look at cross-border payments. And I think the reason that there was a real demand for improvement there was that we've seen quite a lot of speeding up and reduction in cost in domestic payments over the last few years leading up to 2020 and further up to now. And that really sort of highlighted that actually things weren't progressing as fast in cross-border, and the kind of costs of cross-border payments and their speed was still staying higher than we would like, given the importance of that for global trade, for remittances. And so I think that's why there's been a lot of attention on this segment in the last 2 or 3 years, kind of catalyzed by the G20. But I think the G20 were responding to concerns and issues that people were already seeing. I think there was also this kind of concern that actually, because things weren't going as fast and as efficiently as they could in that space, or, you know, it's not all payments that are like that, but you know, a subset of payments aren't as fast and cheap as they should be, that there was a bit of a worry that also kind of new players, new entrants might come in and try and disrupt that sector with different technologies, and that might have impacts for central banks, our ability to implement policy, or on the industry more widely. I think what we're seeing in the UK is that actually there is good progress in some areas on speeding up cross-border remittances, making them cheaper. That's often kind of new banks and non-bank players who are coming along and doing that. But particularly in the wholesale space, which is what we focus on in RTGS, there's still a long way to go before we can get that real instant payment feel for large value cross-border payments that you definitely get domestically.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, maybe I can add to that a little bit. Sorry, just going to jump right in. From the US, definitely echo what John's mentioned. And, you know, at the clearinghouse, we definitely as a market infrastructure have a line of sight to the G20 roadmap and kind of are doing our part, which I'll talk about a little bit later. What we've seen is also, you know, technical advances has come about across payments, and it is taking slower to incorporate that into the cross-border market. So you see it in pockets with some closed loop systems, maybe more on the retail P2P side. And, you know, as people travel back and forth and they want to have similar experiences, but it is a little bit too slow. I know we're not the most innovative, fast moving industry, but it is a little bit slow. And that's where the push, I think, of the roadmap came from, is from a wholesale and from a B2B perspective. We as an industry need to do more, and we need to do it more quickly to drive transparency and access, to drive, you know, cost is going down, but value is increasing. So finding that new way of doing cross-border payments in the age of 24/7 is what, you know, I feel like in the US we're trying to kind of wrap our heads around today and into the future.
Mm-hmm. And Alice, let's get your perspective then from a kind of Canadian point of view, having heard from John and Elena there. What are your thoughts?
So I think very similar to, in particular, Elena's points, because Canada very similar to the US, although not exactly the same, but quite similar in its kind of market structure here. You know, we do see what I would call the point solutions, or the closed loop systems that I think Elena called. These typically are at the forefront. I mean, let's face it, the fintech market moves quite quickly, but at the same time, these type of solutions are very specific. They're point solutions. They address a certain market need, but unlike central market infrastructures, really are not really, I would say, focus on a ubiquitous nature of what needs to be over the long run existing between the various jurisdictions. You know, I've personally had the opportunity to work in Europe for you know, more than a decade. So, you know, making that contrast between what we have in Canada versus what's kind of normal in continental Europe, where you can send a payment from Denmark to Germany without even considering the fact that it's a cross-border payment. Yes, it has to do with the fact that, you know, the unification of account numbers, the fact that it's a single currency and all that, but those were systematic enablers that were put in the system. In North America in particular, we don't have those capabilities in place. They're not structured like that, and therefore there is this capability that basically it first comes in through, you know, the fintechs or these commercial products that are out there. But what has to happen is the central market infrastructures essentially need to systematically be built out, obviously, in order to support those needs, because, you know, both the retail banking as well as commercial banking, the needs are there. You know, if you look at the profile of Canada, certainly, you know, on the commercial side, the trade between the US and Canada is quite robust. So the needs to have those kind of payments occur fairly seamlessly at a low cost, to Joan's point, is key to success. And obviously, the profile of our population in this country has a very vast network globally, right? So in the retail space, especially, the needs to have the global enablers, active. That's key. So.
Mm-hmm. So a few pain points then that all three of you have identified. So my second question to you all is where you see room for more efficiency, and then what opportunities will those efficiencies create for businesses and for consumers? So, on the wholesale and the retail side of things. Elena, let's start with you on this one, please.
Yeah, sure. So we all kind of lead towards kind of harmonizing different work streams. So the more we harmonize behaviors and patterns and data and rules and regs, I feel like the more efficient we can be, which ultimately leads to a kind of more consistent but a better experience to the end consumers and businesses, right? They're the ones that need to move money. I'll maybe highlight the ones related to rules and regs and governance. This is, I think, a work stream we're just starting to get into. I guess from the clearinghouse point of view, we have an advocacy division that works across different associations, banking associations, as well as regulatory bodies. And the conversations are on how can we push global practices across AML, compliance, obligations of settlement to a more consistent pattern. This is really hard conversations because every domestic jurisdiction has reasons why they do different levels of compliance, right? Different domestic patterns, different identity, different rules and kind of oversight. And so it's a very interesting conversation, but it is one of the themes back to going back to the G20. I feel like it's our North Star of that roadmap. There's a big work stream around making the legal, regulatory, and supervisory frameworks more consistent so that the end consumers and corporates can have that consistent experience. We do touch on payment system interoperability. ISO 20022 is a data standard. Maybe John and Alice will talk about that. I just wanted to highlight the importance of kind of the regulatory conversations happening now that I felt like wasn't happening before, as like a great movement and a step forward towards that. So that's what I'll start with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great to hear. And as you mentioned or referred to the G20 as the kind of North Star, it seems right to go to John next to elaborate a bit more on that. So John, over to you.
Yeah, no, I agree with all the points Elena made. And to say that when the G20 started looking at this in 2020, I think the findings, which I don't think will surprise all the payment experts in this audience, is that when you start to think about the cross-border problem, you've got this issue that all the issues, the little frictions that might affect you domestically, just get kind of magnified and build upon each other. And so I completely agree that some of the regulatory frictions are really tricky. But it's also about just differences in the technologies or difference in the way things are operationalized, implemented. And so to pick a couple of examples where friction arises and then there are things you can do about it. One of the there's a sort of set of frictions that come from regulation, which are around kind of AML and sanctions and screening of payments. And then the rules might differ subtly country to country, or sometimes even not subtly, but then it also really affects, it makes it hard to implement all those rules in different jurisdictions when you're not sending the same bits of information to each other. So that's why the move to ISO 20022, which was successfully done in Canada very recently, we in the UK want to do that move for our RTGS system in June this year. And it's a sort of global move across all the major currencies, over the next few years. That's why something like that can be really particularly crucial for cross-border payments, because you can then much more get more harmonized information flowing across the messages. If you can, even if you haven't harmonized the regulation yet, that will just be much more predictable where the bit of information you need to look at to screen the data, the payment will be. But then if you can then build kind of regulatory harmonization on top of that, then you kind of double the win. And so that's an example of why when the cross-border roadmap was put out, it's got this very broad focus on it. It had 19 building blocks at the start. And I think the idea was to say some of these frictions, they're not just, if they were simple to address or there was one friction that was causing everything, it would have happened already. The point here is you need to move lots of things in concert. So you need to move various technical and operation constraints and try and kind of harmonize or get rid of those, and you need to move regulatory and supervisory constraints or constraints around data all at the same time. And so that's why the roadmap had this very broad approach. But I think you can still categorize it down into a few areas that all need harmonizing for this kind of these efficiencies to be realized.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And Alice, I see you nodding along there. Do you want to chime in on this?
Yeah, certainly. So I think the question around the harmonization of the data is one of the key elements here. Just because you have two jurisdictions that both run on ISO 20022 doesn't necessarily mean the specifications are the same. There is still a required effort for a harmonization, right? So it certainly is not as a slam dunk. Even with the common standard, obviously, is a far more difficult endeavor if the standards are different, right? So then you don't even speak the same language. I mean, in the case of ISO, at least you're speaking the same language, and really you're harmonizing rather than really trying to learn a different language. So, but that's a key element in making the interconnectivity. And as John called out, obviously for our high value payments, that was a successful delivery we had just recently. But I think the overall kind of modernization effort that's taking place, not only for Canada but in other jurisdictions, is the momentum that I think will carry this through. And I'm personally focused on the real-time payments, which really has to do with the single credit transfers. And I think the secret sauce is the interconnectivity between the various rails that on those single credit transfers that will basically directly address the question of the current process, which really is relatively expensive and relatively cumbersome. So it is really the secret sauce, I think, is the interconnectivity between those rails.
Mm-hmm.
I think maybe I could add one point. So there's a new, I think it's new, a new initiative that the CPMI, and I think we'll have an acronym list kind of on the chat, but for an ISO 20022 harmonization exercise. And so they're going through that, looking across, what should kind of the purposes of something, the data be based upon the schemes and the different markets. I think what is coming out of those discussions is it's a tricky balance of how much you harmonize, because you might lose, the business purpose of a particular field, even though it's formatted correctly, it's the same data length, it says the address field or whatever it is, but the business purpose of that field could slightly be different, and that completely changes the nature of the payment. And it's an awesome exercise to do, because you have to find, the more harmonized we get, we also have to look at the unintended consequences of harmonizing that, and then what might come to fruition, and then working around that. So I think that's that'll be an exciting kind of update. Maybe we'll do next year after that harmonization exercise comes to pass, and we see the benefits of across both high value and real-time payment systems, right, and retail systems moving to ISO.
So I guess when we're thinking or talking about modernization and initiatives around payments, as we've kind of alluded to so far, many of these are largely focused on kind of domestic real-time payment infrastructure. So how can we take those learnings and sort of extend those out to cross-border payments, and what efforts are there on a kind of global scale to enhance cross-border payments? I know we've touched on a few of these, but I think worth kind of digging into a little bit deeper. Alish, do you want to start us off here?
Yeah, I've already mentioned the fact that the momentum from the modernization should be the kind of the moving into cross-border. So certainly fully agree with that statement. And I think the key element that we really need to, or the main learning is to focus on, I think the term I used before also is a ubiquitous solution, so that we don't end up with many different platforms that are capable of extending into the cross-border, but don't necessarily have the ability to speak to one another, or rather are between two jurisdictions and they're not reusable for others, right? It's all about having a good model that that obviously is reusable and is extensible to across jurisdictions. That is a lot easier said than done. And I know some of my colleagues here right now are also working on some of those, so I'll let them speak to it. But the key element is figuring out some of those challenges that exist today with the model, such as addressing the element of correspondent banking, which in and of itself is relatively cumbersome, and being able to come up with a model that technically doesn't perhaps require the same principles or same banks to work in those jurisdictions in order to extend to others. So just an idea, a thought, but the ubiquitous nature of the approach is, I think, key in the long run.
Mm-hmm. John, do you want to come in on that? Because obviously you've got some learnings there from the G20. So what's the state of play there when it comes to sort of modernization?
Yeah, well, I think when the roadmap was set out, it was clear this was going to be a long-term, multi-year, global kind of approach to this. We've picked out some of the things that have already happened. I think if you were to characterize what's happened so far, I think kind of two important stages have happened. One is that the FSB G20 got together and sort of set some targets and said, here are some targets that we'd like to try and meet in the long term, around cost of transactions, speed of transactions, something around access to the ability to make cross-border transactions, and something around transparency as well, and the ability to kind of get transparency on what service you're going to get before you initiate the payments. And I think that's an important long-term marker to put down. Say, okay, we're now putting down a yardstick that we're going to use to try and measure how we're doing in this space, and hopefully see improvement and kind of drive focus into, well, where are the problem areas? So that's a big step forward, I think. But we'll take it's going to be several years before we're measuring ourselves against those targets, because lots of these initiatives are kind of multi-year initiatives, but it gives you something to aim towards. And then I think the other thing that's sort of largely happened now is a load of stock taking around all the different areas to say, well, on this area, like operating hours, or on this area around data standards, what is the current state of play? What are the differences? What are the similarities? What are the initiatives that are already going on? So I think those two steps between them have put us in now a good place to say, okay, we can identify the main ways to go forward. Mm-hmm. Latest kind of, the roadmap is one of those things that needs to evolve over time. So kind of latest evolution is saying, now we understand all this, let's try and prioritize. And there's going to be a couple of new task forces that are being set up. One of them is focusing on kind of the stuff that Elena was discussing around legal, regulatory and supervisory matters. And I think you're kind of led by the FSB, and that's going to be important in terms of trying to take all that information from those stock takes and then focus in on the key frictions that regulators and rule writers can address. And then there's another one around payments interoperability and extension, which is all about identifying those kind of technical and operation areas where there are differences of approach that can be harmonized and aligned and things like that. So you're gradually seeing a process of looking at the whole space, understanding it, and then prioritizing and focusing and trying to kind of, I think it's also trying to sort of pass the baton from the public sector to the private sector and say, there are still important roles for the public sector, but here are things that the private sector can then support on. I just wanted to mention one specific thing because I was quite involved in it. One of the work stock takes was looking at operating hours specifically. So it's just to unpack how these stock takes kind of look. There, kind of a detailed piece of work was done where we looked into the operating hours that all the different kind of key infrastructures around the world run on currently, and then identifying what that meant about kind of periods in which certain currencies can't speak to it, certain other currencies, certain cross-border flows can't happen, to try and identify the areas where you would get most benefit from extending, but also to give a toolkit to operators of systems to say, if you're thinking about extending, here's how to think about the benefits, here's how to think about the costs, here's how to think about the challenges you will face as you do this. And so that was done both in operating hours and actually also in access to central bank money systems. And that's just an example of how this sort of stock taking approach can then help people identify what are the key areas that they need to focus on, and then they give them a set of actions that they can follow to try and address those frictions.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, John. That's really interesting to hear about. And Elena, I want to hear from you, if we can, about the work that the Clearinghouse has done. I believe it's on the IXB initiative. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so thank you for that. I think kind of exactly what was being discussed so far. So one approach we've started to do to interconnect systems is taking advantage of the real-time payment network that we built here in the US. As a lot of countries have built real-time payment networks, one of our missions in building that, one of our key principles was for global interoperability and cross-border. And so starting about 2-3 years ago, we started working closely with EBA Clearing, which is kind of our sister organization in Europe related to market infrastructures, in trying to unpack, what would it take to connect both domestic real-time payment networks together and kind of bring to life what we're talking about here today. We have both ISO 20022 on each side. We both have real-time 24/7 systems. We have financial institutions connected on both sides, instant settlement, all great. And all, on paper, very similar. And so we started that, and we actually did a proof of concept, technical proof of concept, where we're able to kind of have a technical translator in the middle for the slight variations, right? Because no ISO is the same. In order to really transact end to end, we had SLA goals in mind related to, okay, if it starts on one end and goes the other, how many seconds is a good experience for both sides? Meaning, we were thinking 45 seconds or so end to end. Technically, it takes about 11 to actually make sure that the money and the flow all moves in real time. So we have synchronized settlement involved. And that was a great proof of concept. We executed that. And then we are kind of moving to the next work stream, which is really around governance and really around, okay, who is responsible and liable for each part of not the transaction from a settlement perspective, from a compliance perspective. And so that IXB is kind of that box, right? That it kind of interconnects domestic networks or different networks together. And now concurrently, we're looking at, does that model fit with Canada, for example, or with the UK, looking also in other jurisdictions in Asia and Australia. So kind of the APAC region to kind of say, okay, does this blueprint work? Where do we need to tweak and change? How do the legal liabilities and responsibilities need to evolve? So, it's a really exciting time to kind of begin to show proof that, the roadmap can be executed, and the vision that it has, can be done. And then, we do our part in the infrastructure connecting, and ideally that gets translated into what the end consumer and corporate have available. Because, for me, the value of a domestic real-time network is not only the money moves maybe faster, but really you have confirmation immediately, and that, process is done. So if we can extend that globally, where there's no settlement risk involved because end to end it's happening, that's, where I think, we need to go. So that initiative is beginning to really take shape and move forward.
Great. It sounds like a fascinating initiative, and great to hear about kind of what stage you're at there. And I know we've talked already quite a bit about speed, efficiency, transparency when it comes to cross-border payments. My next question is really, what about richness of data? So what role does data have to play in all this? Alice, I want to come to you first on this one.
Okay, so I see it as twofold. One, obviously, the kind of that primary use case for the end consumer, especially for kind of the corporate clients that most financial institutions deal with, where you can bring in full invoicing type of information and all the kind of various promises of the rich remittance information, rich information that ISO 2022. So I think that applies domestic as well as cross-border. There's no question about it. Where I think the kind of the even more significant value is in cross-border is for data richness is in safety and soundness. In other words, the fact that domestically we already have, each jurisdiction has structures in place in order to be able to track source of funds and so on and so forth. It becomes a completely different animal when you're going cross-border, right? And the fact that the data that comes along can be used for ensuring things around sanctioning and screening of payments to make sure that whether it's terrorist financing, human exploitation, and so on, can be stopped or limited based on the knowledge that can be basically gained from these payments. In my opinion, is an area that we should be exploring and make sure that is used for the good purpose, so that the proper payments go through and the bad ones don't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much for starting us off on that. Elena, data richness, Alice said there about soundness and security. Do you want to pick up from that?
Yeah, no, he's spot on. I think, so I used to previous life be in fintech and a lot of software development. And there is a fine balance with how much data you can churn through in real time to provide effective kind of results. And so I try to balance data richness and what can be done proactively, so as the payment's being processed, and then what can be done as value add after the fact. And so both are tremendously important, but for different reasons, that we don't want to kind of make heavy on a payment. So you don't want to put too much in one envelope because we need it, right? As I said earlier, like the faster we can process for that confirmation, the better off we are as an industry. But in today's day of data insights, what I think happens in the payment after the fact, say, corporate reconciliation and cash flow forecasting, that a lot of that can be in payment trends and payment activity. So we might not need, for regulatory, I think the regulatory industry would say, put as much data, address fields, individuals, birth dates, sisters' birth dates, sons' birth dates, all of that around there. But I think what I'm excited about with some of the ISO conversations is some of the different business purposes. So we do always talk about invoice and remittances. The standardizing of some of that would be, I think, utopia, but getting to a common language around business purpose for closing invoices timely, or managing exceptions of partial payments. Being able to deal with a lot of the exception processes of payments that businesses have to do, particularly small businesses, to enable them to do what they want to do, right? They don't want to manage the payment side of it. They want to grow their business. If they can do that through some data richness in the payload, and the fintechs and banks can provide that in reports or data insights, I think that would really take the friction out of some of the payment processing.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you, Elena. And John, do you want to add to that some examples, bringing in ISO, of course?
Yeah, I agree with all that. And I think what underlines is that adopting ISO is just the sort of foundational step to get you through the door to, okay, I've now got a technology that can carry this type of richness, but there's loads more work for us to do to figure out what are the rich things we want to prioritize, how do we want to carry them. Little bit on what we're doing in the UK just to get us started down this is that we identified a couple of areas with our industry when we were thinking about how we wanted to implement ISO, around legal entity identifiers and around purpose codes for payments, where we thought, okay, there's some richness in the standard that shouldn't be such a big reach for our participants to start populating. It's not on the old set of messages, but it might well be things that in certain cases they're already collecting this information, or they can go away and find it. So we've tried to put some expectations on a timeline over which we want people to not just start using ISO data, but kind of all the same fields as they've been using in the past, but just with more information in them, but start to add these fields that weren't being carried before, like LEI. And that's just an early start in there. Then I think, the sky is hopefully the limit. We've hopefully picked a standard here that has a lot of kind of extensibility in it. One that always strikes me as just so important in the cross-border space, going to be hard, but we have to get there, is this idea of character sets. Currently, cross-border payment messages basically carry the Latin character set. And so, not surprising that it's not easy to validate names or addresses that are actually fundamentally written in another character set, are written in Chinese characters or Hindi characters or whatever it is, and so that is not an easy lift. It's not something we'll be able to do overnight, but that kind of thing feels, if you want to make this truly global and truly cross-border, that's the type of way you need to be eventually agreeing how you use the standards, so that you can everyone can kind of be communicating in their own language, and then you can find ways to make that work. And that's not an easy thing, but it's just to give, as well as LEIs and purpose codes as a near-term example, give a sort of long-term example of how the richness that you should be able to gather can really move you forward.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, some important points there. Thank you, John. And let's talk about innovation. We've seen an increasing amount of innovation in kind of domestic money movement solutions. You've all kind of alluded to that already. So do you think this kind of trend for innovation will become more widespread, into cross-border payments? And in fact, it really should do as soon as possible, presumably, to get to some of these places that you've been talking about in terms of cross-border. John, what are some of the opportunities, the challenges around addressing innovation in cross-border payments?
Yeah, what I would say is we've talked about some really important building blocks that can enable this, taking these great advances that have been made technologically, operationally, domestically, and then expanding them out. The first thing is a sort of word of caution, which is, say, when we talk to firms who are trying to do this, the big thing they say, and it's what we've been alluding to all the way through, is just don't underestimate the challenge of taking something that works in one place and making it work in another 180 countries or whatever it is, another 200 countries. Because even small differences, just to make that business model work and then move into another environment and make exactly the same business flow work, but just with slightly different local customs and technologies and rules and everything. That's what makes it so hard to take a really kind of winning business idea that works in your country and then make it work in all those places in something as regulated as payments, because you then need to go and connect into lots of different infrastructures. That's always a little bit different. So that's just to say that's what the challenge is. I think this scalability challenge is quite profound when you go cross-border, and then you bring time zones into it and kind of language barriers and things like that. So it is hard. I think it's exactly what we've talked about of saying that's where everything needs to be as harmonized as possible. So the good news is that although it's hard, there is a massive opportunity there. The sort of cost savings, the kind of the scale of the markets that can be accessed if you can truly get things working cross-border are huge as well. So that's why I think so much effort is going into it. So I do think the innovation we're seeing domestically, we will see the trend of that spreading. I think at the moment it's spreading quite slowly and more slowly than we would like. And that's why all this public and private effort to try and create the conditions is so important. I'd like to be optimistic and think, as we make progress on that, you will suddenly start seeing it really taking off in the way that we've seen, of course. We've seen big tech companies emerge and be able to trade in every country, but there's something about payments and it's sort of the importance of it and the regulated nature of it that just makes it that bit harder. And then when you multiply that over the globe, it's hard. But I'm long-term optimistic, but short-term it won't just happen super fast, I don't think.
Okay. Yeah, I get the sense of the scale of the opportunity there, but also the kind of the size of some of those obstacles. And Alice, just want to come to you to hear about how you feel kind of innovation is necessary really to get payments up to speed in that sense.
So I think that cross-border in and of itself is not isolated from all the other elements of innovation that are occurring in this space, and payments in particular. And I think in the future, if I have a crystal ball, there will be a correlation or rather a significant enablement between the central bank digital currencies and cross-border. In other words, one of the key elements of the current relatively cumbersome process is what I mentioned before, and that was this correspondent banking structure that we have today. But if we can, again, collectively figure out how to basically transition the international portion or international leg or cross-border leg of these payments when connecting rails, like the example of the IXB that we spoke to earlier, and we can figure out how to do that using digital currencies, I think there is a way to explore innovation on multiple fronts. On one side, obviously driving this cross-border and the efficiency of what we're trying to attain in reduction in cost, but at the same time, essentially driving and creating the adoption of digital currency. So that's one area that I think is certainly there. Obviously, more kind of I'd say near term, it's really figuring out elements around the messaging standards. It looks easy. It's not. It's quite complex. And I think what was mentioned before is time. Time it seems like it's a simple question to be asked, but synchronicity of a payment, especially when sometimes you have a real-time manages a clock, the other one does not, or they both manage a clock. I mean, these kind of things to make sure that there's integrity in the payment and it basically delivers on the use case that it's being used for, whether it's a person-to-person payment or a payment of an invoice or what have you is key and all, right? So managing time, I think, is another element in the near term that has to be figured out.
Okay, thank you, Alice. And speaking of time, we are quickly running out. So just very quickly, sort of 10 seconds from each of you, if possible, on this final question. What is the top efficiency in cross-border payments that you want to see in place today? Alice?
Cost reduction.
Elena?
Oh, I want to see that confirmation happen immediately so we can move on with our lives.
And John?
Slightly from left field, but because it's important to us, I want to see the wholesale rails getting onto the sort of API as a way of exchanging information rather than messaging, and that way wholesale and retail will be kind of working in the same way, and they'll be much easier to bring together in one kind of harmonized ecosystem.
Well, on that note of sort of harmonization, it's something that's come up throughout this discussion. We shall leave it there. I just want to thank the three of you. So thank you, John, Elena and Alesh, for joining me today and for answering those questions. I think for those of you watching, this is obviously a really exciting space. There's lots to come still. Obviously, I know a few of you express that kind of sense of urgency that you'd like to see a little bit more in the cross-border payment space. So let's hope that this time next year we'll have seen some more movement there. But all it leaves me to say is thank you for joining us, and until next time, goodbye.